mining colony of Kara Station smelled like rust and ozone, and Daniel Reyes had stopped noticing it 3 years ago. He adjusted the strap of his toolkit, wiped sweat from his jaw, and looked up at the sky just as the Imperial shuttle broke through the clouds, sleek, golden, and far too clean for a place like this. Nobody important ever came to Kareth. That was the whole point of Kareth. It was where the Vael Empire sent things it didn't want to think about: broken equipment, forgotten labor contracts, and men like Daniel, who had survived a war nobody back home liked to talk about, and came out the other side with steady hands and very little patience for ceremony. But today was different. Today, the entire colony had been ordered to stand in the dust under the heat of 2 suns and watch as the heir to the Vael throne stepped off that shuttle, Prince Aurelion, 19 years old in dragon years, which Daniel had been told meant something close to a human in his mid-20s, old enough to carry a crown, young enough to still believe the galaxy made sense. He was beautiful in a way only dragons could be. Scales the color of burnished copper catching the light, wings folded with practiced elegance. Every movement choreographed for an audience that had been rehearsing how to look impressed since sunrise. Daniel didn't know why a prince was visiting a colony that mined low-grade or in recycled water for a living. Nobody did. The official statement said routine inspection. Daniel had spent 6 years in the military long enough to know that when an empire used the word routine, it usually meant the opposite. The ceremony began. Officials bowed. Colony administrators read. Speeches nobody believed. Daniel stood near the back with the other maintenance crews, arms crossed, half listening, half wondering if he could slip away before the heat made his head pound. That was when he saw it. A flicker, barely a stumble, in the prince's stride. A half-second of hesitation. No one else seemed to catch. Then Aurelion's wings dropped. His knees buckled, and in front of 40,000 recorded eyes and a dozen Imperial cameras, the heir to the Vael Empire collapsed onto the platform like something inside him had simply stopped working. For 1 full second, nobody moved. Imperial Guards froze, trained for armies and assassins, not for a prince folding in on himself in broad daylight. Officials stared. Somewhere a woman screamed, and Daniel, 3 years removed from a war that had taught him exactly what dying looked like in the first 60 seconds, was already moving before his brain caught up with his legs. He shoved past 2 stunned guards, dropped to his knees beside 800 pounds of convulsing dragon, and did the only thing his hands knew how to do under pressure. He checked the airway, found it closing, and pressed 2 fingers against a pulse point no human had ever been trained to read on a creature like this. The skin under his hand was burning hot, far hotter than it should have been. Foam gathered at the corner of the prince's mouth, tinged faintly gold. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had seen poisoning before. He had seen it kill men twice as strong as this in under 3 minutes. "Get me your medics now," he shouted, voice cutting to the panic. But the response wasn't help. It was horror. A guard grabbed his shoulder hard enough to bruise. Screaming words Daniel didn't fully understand but recognized instantly by tone. A warning, a threat, a command to remove his hands immediately. Because under the oldest written law of the Vael Empire, no creature outside the royal bloodline was permitted to touch a member of that bloodline without explicit sanction. The punishment for violating that law wasn't exile. It wasn't imprisonment. It was death, carried out without trial, without appeal, without mercy, and every soldier on that platform knew it. Daniel heard the warning. He understood exactly what it meant. And for reasons he would spend the rest of his life trying to fully explain, he didn't let go. He held the convulsing body of the only heir to a 10,000-year-old empire in his arms, pressed his palm against a wound no one else had even noticed yet, and looked up at the guards now raising their weapons toward him with the same calm, unshaken expression he wore in every crisis that had ever tried to break him. "If you want him alive," Daniel said quietly, "you're going to let me work." Above him, the golden eyes of Prince Aurelion flickered open for just a moment and fixed impossibly directly on him. The weapon stayed raised, but no one fired. For 3 full seconds, the entire platform held its breath, caught between a law that demanded Daniel's death and a prince whose golden eyes were locked onto human, kneeling over him like he recognized something he couldn't name. Then Aurelion's body convulsed again, an instinct one where law had hesitated. The guards lowered their rifles, not out of mercy, but because killing Daniel now meant killing him with the prince still seizing his arms. and not even the most rigid soldier wanted to be the one responsible for that headline. To understand how a maintenance worker ended up holding the future of an empire in his hands, you have to understand what the Vael Empire actually was. It wasn't simply a kingdom of dragons. It was 10,000 years of uninterrupted rule, a civilization so old it had stopped counting conquests and started counting eras instead. The Vael called themselves the First Flame, the species that had clawed its way out of myth and into godhood, and over the centuries they had built an empire that stretched across hundreds of star systems, each one absorbed, cataloged, and quietly reminded of its place. Species were not equals in the Vael Empire. They were tiers. Tier 1 were the Vael themselves. Tier 2 were old allies, trusted enough to hold minor governorships. And Tier 3, the bottom rung, the disposable rung, was where humanity had been filed the moment the Empire discovered Earth 40 years ago, decided humans were clever enough to be useful and weak enough to be controlled, and folded them quietly into the labor economy that kept colonies like Kara Station running. Daniel Reyes had been a child when the first Vael ships entered Earth orbit, and a soldier by the time humanity's brief. Doomed resistance collapsed into voluntary integration, a phrase Daniel had learned to say without flinching, the same way you learn to say the names of friends who didn't make a home. He had served 6 years in the integration conflict, the war nobody back on Earth liked to name directly, and he'd come out of it as a field medic who had patched more wounds than he could count and lost more people than he allowed himself to remember. When the war ended, there was no parade. There was a contract, a colony assignment, and a quiet expectation that he would disappear into machinery of the Empire like everyone else. He had tried to disappear. For 3 years, he had kept his head down, fixed water recyclers, avoided politics, and told himself that surviving quietly was its own kind of victory. He didn't volunteer for things. He didn't draw attention. He had buried the part of himself that used to run toward gunfire instead of away from it. But some instincts don't disappear. They wait. And the moment Prince Aurelion hit the ground convulsing in front of 40,000 witnesses, the soldier and Daniel woke up before the careful, quiet colony worker could stop him. Now that same instinct was keeping a prince alive while an empire's law screamed at him to step away. Daniel worked fast, methodical, his hands steady in a way that felt almost obscene given the chaos around him. He tilted Aurelion's head, cleared the airway, pressed 2 fingers against the pulse point along his throat, and felt it. Fast, erratic, the unmistakable rhythm of a body fighting something it hadn't been built to survive. The Imperial doctors weren't due to arrive for another 6 minutes by shuttle. Daniel didn't think the prince had 6 minutes. Toxin, he said aloud, mostly to himself, his voice flat and clipped in the way it always became when his training took over. Neural, fast-acting, mimicking respiratory failure. He had seen something like this before, years ago, on a battlefield that had nothing to do with dragons or empires. He didn't know the chemistry. He didn't need to. He knew the pattern, and patterns were something Daniel Reyes had always been frighteningly good at reading. Above him, one golden eye flickered open again, barely a sliver, but enough. Aurelion's clawed hand twitched, then slowly, deliberately, curled around Daniel's wrist with a grip that should have been impossible for a creature in the middle of dying. It wasn't aggression. It was something closer to recognition, the kind of grip a drowning man gives the only hand reaching into the water. The guards around them went rigid again, weapons half raised, voices rising in alarm. Because in 10,000 years of recorded history, no member of the royal bloodline had ever willingly reached for a tier 3 species in front of witnesses. Daniel didn't know what that meant. He didn't have time to know what that meant. All he knew was that the shuttle carrying the Imperial doctor still hadn't landed. The prince's pulse was getting weaker under his fingers, and somewhere above the platform, the first wave of Imperial Guard ships had begun descending, fast, armed, and already broadcasting a single, unmistakable order across every channel on Kara Station. Secure the human. Secure the human came through every comm channel on the platform at once, and Daniel felt the air around him change before he even processed the words. Boots hit the ground in formation behind him. A full Imperial Guard unit. 6 of them, rifles already up, moving with the kind of precision that only came from soldiers who had never once been told no. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Aurelion's grip on his wrist had tightened, and the prince's breathing had gone shallow in a way Daniel recognized from a dozen battlefields he'd spent years trying to forget. Step away from the air. The lead guard barked, close enough now that Daniel could feel the heat off the rifle barrel pointed at his skull. This is your only warning. Daniel didn't look up. He's at maybe 90 seconds before his lungs stopped working entirely. You shoot me now. You're not securing anything. You're killing him. His voice was calm, almost bored, the same flat tone he used to use when telling panicking soldiers to hold still while shrapnel came out of their leg. It wasn't bravado. It was the only language Daniel knew how to speak when the stakes got this high. Quiet, steady, and absolutely unwilling to blink first. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a new voice cut through the chaos, sharp and absolute, and every guard on the platform straightened like they'd been struck. Lower your weapons. The crowd parted, and Empress Seraphine Vael walked through it like the platform itself owed her the space. Daniel had only ever seen her in broadcasts. Towering, ageless, scales the deep red of dried blood, eyes the unsettling gold of the species that had outlived empires before humanity learned to write. In person, she was worse. She didn't move like royalty. She moved like a verdict already decided. She crossed the platform in seconds, dropped to one knee beside her son with control that betrayed nothing, and looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't read at all. "What did you do to him?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped around a thread of something Daniel almost mistook for fear. "Nothing. I kept him breathing." Daniel kept his hands exactly where they were, pressure steady against a wound he'd found along the prince's ribs, gold-tinged blood slick under his fingers. "He's been poisoned. Neurotoxin, fast-acting. Whatever your doctors are bringing, tell them to prep for respiratory paralysis, not cardiac arrest, or they're going to waste the only window he's got left." The Empress's eyes narrowed, and for one terrible second Daniel thought she was going to have the guards drag him off anyway. Law be damned. Son be damned. Instead, she did something none of the soldiers around them expected. She held up one clawed hand, and the entire platform went still. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Because I've watched men die exactly like this before. Different species. Same poison signature." Daniel didn't elaborate. He didn't have time, and frankly, he didn't think the Empress of the Vael Empire wanted to hear about the war that had taught him. Behind her, a tall, narrow-shouldered dragon in dark ceremonial robes stepped forward, his voice smooth and urgent in a way that immediately put Daniel on edge. "Your Majesty, this is exactly the kind of reckless contamination we warned the Council about. A Tier 3 labor should not be handling the heir's body. Execute the breach of law now, before this becomes a precedent the colonies use against us." Daniel didn't know the name yet, but he would learn it soon enough. Lord Corex, head of the Inner Talon, the Empire's Shadow Council, and a dragon whose concern for precedent seemed remarkably louder than his concern for the dying prince 3 feet away from him. The Empress ignored him entirely. Her gaze stayed locked on Daniel, calculating something far more complicated than law. "If my son dies because you wasted time talking instead of working human, I will make your execution the longest in Imperial history." Her eyes flicked once to her son's hand, still locked tight around Daniel's wrist despite the unconsciousness pulling him under. Something shifted behind her expression. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of a question she wasn't ready to ask out loud yet. "Work," she said finally, quieter. "Now." Daniel exhaled and went back to work, hands steady despite the 6 rifles still aimed at his back, despite Corex's voice still hissing protocol violations into the Empress's ear, despite the growing, impossible certainty settling cold in his stomach, that whatever poison was working through Prince Aurelion's body hadn't been an accident, and that the man standing closest to the throne, demanding his immediate execution, seemed far more interested in silencing him than saving the prince at all. The Imperial doctors arrived 4 minutes later, and by then Daniel had already done the part of the job that mattered most. The prince was still breathing, barely, raggedly, but breathing. The medical team swept him with equipment that looked more like sculpture than science, scanning devices humming gold light over Aurelion's chest. And for the first time since the prince collapsed, Daniel let himself sit back on his heels and actually feel the adrenaline draining out of his hands. They were shaking now. They hadn't shaken once during the actual crisis. That was the cruel joke of training like his. The fear always showed up late, after the work was already done. 2 guards hauled him up by the arms before he'd even caught his breath, And this time nobody hesitated to drag him. Daniel didn't fight it. Fighting a 6-soldier escort with rifles trained on his skull wasn't bravery. It was a different kind of stupid, and Daniel had buried that version of himself a long time ago. They marched him off the platform, past a crowd of colonists staring at him like he'd just set himself on fire in public, and into a holding cell beneath the Imperial transport ship that had nothing in it but a cot, a drain, and a single light that never turned off. Nobody told him anything for 6 hours. He sat with his back against cold metal, replaying the moment over and over. The way Aurelion's claw had locked around his wrist with a grip that shouldn't belong to a creature seizing on the edge of death. The way his golden eyes had found Daniel specifically, like he was looking for him rather than simply reaching for the nearest help. Daniel had patched up a lot of dying people in his life. None of them had looked at him like that, like recognition, like relief. He didn't get long to sit with the thought. The cell door opened, and instead of an executioner, in walked someone Daniel hadn't expected at all. Mara Chun, colony fixer, the kind of woman who knew which guards could be bribed and which administrators owed her favors, and the only other human on Kara Station who'd ever bothered learning Daniel's first name. She dropped into the cell's single chair like she owned it, arms crossed, eyes sharp with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent the last 6 hours calling in every favor she had. "You're an idiot," she said, by way of greeting. "Good to see you, too. I mean it, Reyes. You don't touch the royal bloodline. Everyone on this colony knows that law. Children know that law." She leaned forward, voice dropping. "And yet somehow you're not dead yet, which tells me something very strange is happening upstairs that nobody's explaining to either of us." That got Daniel's attention. "He's alive. Stabilizing. According to the one guard I managed to get 5 honest words out of." Mara studied him for a long moment, the kind of look she usually reserved for spotting a lie before it finished forming. "There's something else. The Empress hasn't ordered your execution. She's ordered an audience instead. Tomorrow morning, full court. You're being presented, not punished. At least not yet." Daniel sat with that for a second, the cold dread of execution slowly rearranging itself into something stranger and somehow worse, uncertainty. Why would she do that? "That's the part nobody's saying out loud," Mara said. "But I did hear one thing worth your attention. The medical team that scanned the prince after you stabilize him, they flagged the toxin in his blood as something that hasn't existed in Imperial records for 8,000 years. Banned compound. Outlawed so far back most scholars thought it was myth. She let that sit in the air between them. Somebody used a poison nobody's supposed to have access to anymore, in front of 40,000 witnesses, on the heir to the throne. And the only reason that prince is alive right now is because a maintenance worker with a war he doesn't talk about happened to recognize a symptom pattern from a fight that has nothing to do with dragons." Daniel's jaw tightened. He thought about the torn data shard he'd slipped into his boot before the guards searched him, a fragment of something he grabbed without thinking, tucked into the prince's robes. The kind of instinct that came from years of knowing that whatever someone wants hidden in a crisis is usually the thing worth keeping. He hadn't told Mara about it. He wasn't sure yet if he was going to tell anyone. "There's one more thing," Mara added, quieter now, watching his face carefully. "Lord Corax requested a private session with the Empress 2 hours ago. Closed doors, no record. And not 20 minutes after that meeting ended, a formal execution order for you was drafted." She paused. "It never got signed. The Empress tore it up herself." Daniel looked up at her slowly. Tore it up or stopped it? Mara didn't have an answer for that. Neither, it seemed, did anyone else on Kara Station, except, perhaps, for a prince currently unconscious in an Imperial medbay, whose hand had refused to let go of a human stranger right up until the moment the doctors pried his fingers loose. The core of the Vael Empire was not a room. It was a statement. Daniel was marched through golden doors 3 stories tall, past pillars carved with the names of conquered worlds, into a hall built to make every visitor feel exactly as small as the architects intended. 40,000 witnesses had watched the prince collapse on a dusty mining platform. Today, it felt like all of them had somehow followed him here, packed into galleries that wrapped around the throne room like a coliseum waiting for blood. Guards walked him to the center of the floor and stopped. Daniel stood there in the same maintenance uniform he'd been wearing when he held the prince's life in his hands. Dry gold bloodstains still crusted along his sleeves, because nobody had bothered to let him change. And he understood with total clarity that this was deliberate. He was meant to look small. Tier 3. Disposable. Empress Seraphine sat on a throne that looked carved from a single piece of dark flame glass, and beside her stood Lord Corex, robes immaculate, expression carefully arranged into something resembling patience. Daniel's eyes scanned the room once, fast, the way he used to scan a perimeter before a patrol, and found what he was looking for in a side chamber behind a transparent shield. Prince Aurelion awake, weak, propped upright on a medical frame, golden eyes locked directly on him. Daniel Reyes, the Empress said, and the entire hall fell silent on her voice alone. You stand accused of violating the bloodline law. Unauthorized contact with a member of the royal line. The penalty for this offense has not changed in 10,000 years. She paused, and something in her tone shifted, just slightly, toward a question rather than a verdict. And yet my son is alive specifically because you broke it. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Corex stepped forward smoothly, bowing just enough to seem respectful while cutting straight through her words. Your Majesty, intent does not change the law. If a Tier 3 labor can touch the royal bloodline whenever convenient, the law means nothing. I urge immediate sentencing for the stability of the throne. Convenient, Daniel said, before he could stop himself. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, flat and even across the silent hall. Your prince was dying in the dirt, and your own physicians were 6 minutes out. I didn't do it for convenience. I did it because I've watched men die from waiting, and I wasn't going to watch it happen again over a law that doesn't account for emergencies. Corex's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the Empress raised one clawed hand, silencing him instantly. She studied Daniel for a long moment, the same calculating look from the platform. You diagnosed a poison my own court physicians failed to identify for nearly an hour. A compound erased from Imperial medical records 8,000 years ago. Explain to me, Tier 3 laborer, how you recognize a toxin that does not exist in any database you have access to. The whole hall leaned in. Daniel felt the weight of the question, and beneath it, the much sharper weight of Corex's stare. Too intense, too still, for a man who claimed this was simply about law and order. I didn't recognize the poison, Daniel said carefully. I recognize the pattern. Respiratory shutdown disguised as something else. Time slow enough to look natural. I've seen that exact strategy used before. Not the chemistry, the tactic. Someone who wants a death to look accidental uses a delivery method like that. It's not medical knowledge, Your Majesty. It's battlefield knowledge. Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that made the air feel thinner. The Empress's gaze flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward Corex, and for just a heartbeat, something passed behind her ancient golden eyes that looked uncomfortably like suspicion. Bring forward the medical findings, she commanded, and an attendant stepped up with a data tablet, projecting a slow rotation of toxin analysis above the floor. My physicians confirmed Lord Reyes' assessment. The compound is identified as Thessaline 7, a neurotoxin banned by Imperial Decree 8,000 years ago after its use in the Glasswing Purge. Production of this compound was outlawed across every world in this empire. Possession alone is a capital offense. Her eyes swept the hall slowly, deliberately, before settling back on Corex with stillness that made even Daniel's skin prickle, which raises a question I expect this court to take very seriously. If this compound has not existed anywhere in the Empire for 8,000 years, who manufactured it for my son 3 days ago? Corex's composure didn't break, not exactly, but Daniel saw it. The smallest hesitation, half a second too long, before he answered. An investigation is already underway. Your Majesty, I would caution against distraction. The matter before this court is a human's violation, not idle speculation about. It is not idle. Came a new voice, weak but unmistakably steady, cutting to the chamber from a medical alcove. Every head turned. Prince Aurelion had pulled himself forward against the protest of 2 attendants, gripping the edge of his frame, golden eyes burning with something far older than his 19 years. Mother, I need to speak. Now, before this court decides anything about that man. The hall went utterly silent. Even Corex, who had spent the last several minutes steering the conversation with practiced precision, seemed to freeze at the sight of the prince forcing himself upright against his attendant's hands. Daniel watched the medical shield retract as two healers wheeled Aurelion's frame closer to the throne floor, his scales still dull from the poison, one wing hanging slightly low in the other, but his eyes were sharp, focused, and locked with an intensity that made the entire room feel smaller. "Aurelion, you should be resting," the Empress said, and for the first time since Daniel had seen her, there was something almost soft in her voice. A mother briefly, before the ruler returned. "I'll rest after this is finished." The prince's gaze swept the gallery before settling on Daniel, and something in his expression made Daniel's stomach tighten. Not gratitude. Urgency. 3 days before the ceremony at Kara Station, I requested this man specifically be present during the inspection. Not by name. I didn't know his name, but I requested that the colony's senior medical staff attend the platform during my visit. I was told there was no senior medical staff assigned to Kareth, that a single maintenance technician with prior combat medical training was the only qualified individual on the entire colony. His eyes didn't leave Daniel's face. I asked for him before I ever knew his name, before the poison, before any of this. The murmur that swept through the gallery this time was different, confused, unsettled, a ripple of 40,000 recalculations happening at once. Daniel felt it too, a cold certainty sliding into place. He hadn't been a bystander. He'd been positioned. "That's absurd," Corex said quickly, too quickly. The prince was poisoned and weakened. His memory of events leading up to the incident cannot be considered reliable testimony before this court. "My memory," Aurelion said, voice rising with an effort that clearly cost him, "is perfectly intact, Lord Corex, which is more than I can say for the itinerary changes that were made to my visit 4 days ago. Changes I did not authorize, rerouting my arrival schedule through Kara Station instead of the original inspection site at Velmara." He turned, slow and deliberate, to face the inner Talon council seated along the eastern gallery. Changes that, according to travel logs, were submitted and approved by the inner Talon's logistics office. "Your office, my lord." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Corex's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack Daniel had seen in his composure since the throne room doors opened. "Itinerary management is a routine administrative function, Your Highness. I assure you." "I'm not finished." Aurelion's voice cut to the protest like a blade, and Daniel realized in that moment that whatever weakness the poison had left behind, the prince's mind was working faster than anyone in the room had accounted for. "I was carrying research material during that visit, personal research, unrelated to imperial business, regarding archival records from the pre-dynastic era, records sealed under your office's jurisdiction, Lord Corex, which I have been formally denied access to for the past 6 months. His eyes flicked briefly, almost too fast to catch, toward Daniel's boot, the same boot where a torn data shard had been sitting since the moment of the attack. "That research material is missing from my personal effects since the incident. I would like it noted, formally, that I consider its recovery a matter of imperial security." Daniel kept his face perfectly still, the way he'd trained himself to do under fire a long time ago, while his mind raced. The prince knew. He wasn't asking the court to find the data shard. He was telling Daniel, in front of 40,000 witnesses and a man who very likely wanted them both dead, to keep it hidden. The Empress's eyes moved slowly between her son and Corex, something calculating and cold settling behind her expression. "Lord Corex, you rerouted my son's travel schedule, denied him access to sealed archival research, and now stand before this court and insist his testimony be dismissed as poison out of confusion. On the same day someone administered a compound to him that has not existed in this empire for 8,000 years. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Tell me, truthfully, why I should not consider you the most logical suspect standing in this hall." For the first time, Corex said nothing at all, and in the silence that followed, Daniel understood with absolute clarity that the data shard hidden in his boot wasn't just evidence of crime. It was the reason he was still alive, and very possibly the reason he wasn't going to stay that way for long. Corex's silence lasted only a moment before he chose the one move left to a cornered man: escalation. "This is a coordinated fabrication," he snarled, robe snapping as he turned to address the gallery instead of the throne. A poisoned prince, a conveniently positioned human, and now accusations against a sworn member of the Inner Talon, based on nothing but a sick boy's confused memory. "I will not stand here and let 10,000 years of law collapse because this court has fallen in love with a Tier 3 laborer's heroics." His hand moved fast, faster than anyone expected from a council lord twice Daniel's age, sliding toward the ceremonial blade at his hip. If the prince's testimony cannot be trusted, then neither can his judgment regarding who lives and who dies in this hall. The guards reacted half a second too slow. Daniel didn't. Years of instinct that had never fully gone quiet sent him moving before conscious thought caught up, stepping directly into Corex's path, put his own body between the blade and the medical frame, where Aurelion sat too weak to defend himself. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't bravery in the way stories like to describe it. It was simply the same reflex that had made him kneel in the dirt 3 days ago, the refusal to let something break in front of him when he had a choice not to let it. The blade never landed. 2 Imperial Guard seized Corex from behind, but it wasn't the guards that stopped the room cold. It was Aurelion, dragging himself fully upright off the medical frame against every protest from his attendants, golden eyes blazing despite the exhaustion still etched into every line of his body. He crossed the distance to Daniel in 3 unsteady steps and did something no member of the royal bloodline had done in recorded imperial history. He placed his clawed hand directly over Daniel's, palm to palm, and spoke words in the old tongue that made every dragon in the hall drop instantly to one knee. Not out of command, but out of something far older than command, something written into their biology before politics or empire ever existed. The Empress rose from her throne so fast her own robes nearly caught. "Aurelion." "The calling bond," she breathed, and the words rippled to the hall like a shock wave, 40,000 witnesses suddenly understanding what they were watching. The calling bond wasn't sentiment. It wasn't gratitude. It was an ancient, irreversible biological right, dormant for 10 millennia, triggered only when a dragon's body recognized something far deeper than friendship, a creator-kin, a caretaker bond, written into instincts that predated the empire itself. It could not be faked. It could not be performed for show, and it had just been invoked in front of the entire court by the heir to the throne, toward a human labor imperial law had classified as disposable. In the chaos that followed, the data shard Daniel had hidden in his boot was finally brought forward, not seized, but offered, placed willingly into the Empress's hands. What it contained ended any remaining argument Corex might have made. Fragmented pre-dynastic records, the very archive he had buried for years, revealed a truth the Vael Empire had erased from its own history. The species that had first uplifted the ancestors of the Vael, gifting them flight, fire, and the intelligence to build an empire, had not been gods. They had been human, Earth's ancestors, millennia before recorded history, before the war, before the word Tier 3 ever existed. Humanity wasn't the Empire's newest acquisition. It was a forgotten root of its entire bloodline. Corex's plan unraveled in real time, broadcast to every world under Imperial control. He hadn't poisoned the prince to start a war with a lesser species. He had poisoned him to bury a truth that would dismantle the very foundation his power was built on, the doctrine that dragons were the galaxy's first and purest creation. He was taken from the hall in silence, stripped of his council seat before the doors had even fully closed behind him. The Empress did not order the archive resealed. She opened it fully, formally, to every world.